So I'm Kristoffer Nielbo, and probably before I start, I should thank all of you, especially Anda, for organizing this. It's super interesting. And also, I mean, given the COVID-19, running workshops, even conferences like DHN is basically a nightmare. So I'm quite impressed how well you're managing to do this. Today, I'm the researcher. I will speak as a researcher. I will present some of the experiences I've had, or my research group has had, working with the kind of data that we just saw some excellent examples of. And let me probably share a screen with you. Okay, so now you should see my slides. So essentially what I want to talk to you about today is the inherent complexity of cultural information. So actually yesterday I was in a workshop with a very good friend and colleague of mine, Tim Sangiolini and Liv Manovich, and it dawned on me that the kind of data that I often see in humanities and actually also social science, so the kind of data that are getting really popular, are pretty much like this. So essentially what you have is sort of a hairball-like structure, because you have very noisy data, you have highly complex data, yet there are some structure in the data here signified by the sort of two groups or clusters you can see in the sort of chromatic coding here. Yet they tend to lack the kind of temporal coordinates, a temporal structure, which here would be sort of a transition of hairballs in a way, right? So this is typically the problem you deal with in cultural analysis or digital humanities, or what Liv Manovich calls cultural analytics. This kind of really, really noisy and complex data where we have to find some structure, and we often tend to overlook or ignore the sort of rich temporal component. This is actually this is a representation of a lot of concepts in Danish newspapers at the outset of COVID-19, where what you actually will see if you sort of prune this graph is that there are essentially two different strategies, two different ways that the media dealt with COVID-19 initially, either as a catastrophe, which was the dominant response, but also as a tragedy, sort of something more literate or more humanities oriented, one might argue. Anyway, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to who I am, what I do. That might actually be the most relevant to you, because I run a research group called the Center for Humanities Computing at Aarhus. That's somewhat similar to the kind of issues you've just been discussing, or at least we are an expression of the same trend or the same sort of situation as we just heard in the previous two talks. Then I will talk a bit about self-affinity in cultural information. So the kind of properties or the structure I often look for in culture information. Then finally, I will talk about pandemic information dynamics, because that's sort of a project that's ongoing. That's something I currently work on, or my research group work on. So that's sort of dropping you in the middle of some active research project. So there's no definite answers there. It's sort of more reflecting how we deal with a research problem, or how your users, for those of you that are sort of infrastructure people or librarians, then how your users struggle with solving problems within their research domain. So who am I? That's a picture of me. Wouldn't be relevant if I was standing in front of you, but sometimes it's convenient when we are having conferences or workshops like this. So my name is Kristoffer. I've studied, initially I studied comparative religion and philosophy, but it dawned on me quite early on that while I thought the kind of cultural processes and the kind of ideas that we were studying were very interesting and very motivating for sort of getting knowledge, or it sort of lacked I needed additional sort of tools or additional ways of working with data or information that couldn't really be provided there. So I changed track to cognitive science and later on to mathematics. I worked in anthropology, I worked in history, literature, zoology, psychology, and psychiatry. Lately, I've actually done quite a bit of work in psychiatry, and I have 2 PhD students at psychiatry at the moment. I work and have worked on a range of the interdisciplinary centers, so Interacting Minds Center in Aarhus, Institute for Pure and Applied Math in Los Angeles, and complexity science and big data technology in China, to mention some. Currently, I'm heading what's called the Center of Humanities Computing Aarhus. It's at Aarhus University, Denmark, but I'll give you a couple of extra words on that in a moment, but essentially what I often try to understand, or what I struggle with as a researcher, is that I want to understand these complex systems, this kind of hairball-like structure, especially as it evolves over time. And what we would really want, or what you would be taught often in sort of in sciences, is that you want to sort of, essentially you want to monitor all the relevant variables. But the problem is that when the system is complex, especially all massively noisy, then it's really inefficient to monitor all the intrinsic variables of that system, if not impossible, right? So you have a social system, how do you really monitor all the relevant variables there? Luckily, we can sort of think of this differently, and we can sort of understand the detailed dynamics, so how the system evolves over time, or describe that, at least some systems, by sort of basically reconstructing the phase space from sort of a scalar time series of the system, right? So we really want to understand how does sort of simple indices of the system evolve, of the system sort of states or behavior, how does it evolve over time? And then we can characterize that system by only a few state variables instead of sort of a random system with essentially infinite amount of degree of freedom, right? So essentially what we want to look for is something like what you see here. We want to turn this enormous hairball into a single variable that evolves over time, and then we can study, for instance, how that variable changes. So in this case, in the lower part here, we are essentially studying the information dynamics of a system, seeing how here we have sort of a random baseline and seeing how sort of particular aspects of it changes, both sort of its central tendencies, but also the variation. What you see up here is another problem that I've dealt with, but essentially in the same way. We essentially studied here how people that suffers from OCD, how they, so obsessive compulsive disorder, how they tended to be very rigid around their behavior. So here you're actually looking at a person that is that's tying his shoes, and we are seeing how he sort of generally sort of at a high level does this. Here we're looking at a very low level, so detail to the laces and so on and so forth over time. So plot against itself, and here we're seeing how that interact. And you can use a plot like this, so this is called a recurrence plot. You can use that to sort of predict whether or not a person suffers from OCD, even at an early in an early age, at least partially. So basically what we want to do, and what I want to talk to you about for the first part of this talk, is how we can sort of approximate the complexity of large-scale cultural systems, so your hairball again, using a small set of dynamic variables, often only 1 or 2 dimensions. Let's see here. But first, again, infrastructure talk also. Center for Humanities Computing Aarhus. That's what I run today. So we are sort of a group. We are probably what you would call a research and development unit. We are so started out as a research group, but now we essentially earn our keep by having a couple of different functions at Aarhus University, at Humanities, but increasingly also at social sciences. We function as a support center. Is probably a little bit, this is probably how many researchers would think about it. Whether or not that's entirely correct, you could discuss. But essentially, we can have some researchers that have some problem they want to deal with, some research problem, and then they might want to collaborate with us. So they sort of throw the the project over to us, and we sit and work with it, and then we collaborate around it. Oh, sorry, and do some joint publication, and often they will pay for some of our developers. We also have a mobility pool. That's a new thing. So if a research group needs an engineer, so research software engineer or young junior developer, we can sort of throw them over to that group for an amount of money, and then they collaborate with that group for the relevant amount of time. We do not teach, but we do work as enablers, and well, we do teach, but we teach in collaboration with people. So we never really teach our own courses, but we do go out to or participate in courses if it's something relevant. Mostly what we are seeing now is actually that we are developing solutions. So you just saw a Jupyter Hub or examples of the littlest Jupyter Hub. We've been hosting many Jupyter Hub servers for students. We've changed the strategy somewhat today, so we are basically using this Kubernetes cluster now, but it's essentially the same services we are providing. So tools, solutions that involve compute for students in humanities and social science. Finally, we are a community of practice, so we develop solutions, things we think are nice to do in particular ways, and we express that as code or as formalizations, and we sort of try to develop standards. So we saw examples of, for instance, Peter talked about FAIR, so we've been dealing a lot with trying to come up with operational standards for FAIR that work on highly unstructured, large collections of highly unstructured data. We are currently, I think, 14, and we have 2 new positions coming up. They're actually open, a PhD and a postdoc we are looking for at the moment. Most people are researchers. There's a couple of students, and then we have a couple of research software engineers also. Sort of a mixture between a lab and an infrastructure. Now, oh, maybe I should just, can I do that? Yes, I can. Maybe I should just stop for a moment and ask if there's any questions before I continue. I know that it can be extremely tiring listening to hours of Zoom. All right, I'll just continue. You're very welcome to interrupt me. I don't feel that I have to. Well, my conclusion is going to be very general, so I can sort of jump around. All right, let's just continue with it up. That doesn't look very good. Just do it this way instead. There we go. Okay, so self-affinity or self-similarity in cultural information. This is a fundamental property that I often think is overlooked. So yesterday, Liv Manovich, he argued that he wanted to get away. He just published a new book, and he argued that he wanted to get away from aggregating data as you're doing in machine learning, as he said. And he wanted to come up with a new way of doing analysis that would pay attention to detail, to sort of the detailed variation, to minute patterns of variation in your data. And that already exists. That has been done for ages. In multiple fields, and one of them is sort of this idea that you can look for sort of self-affinity or self-similarity in data, something that came up in complexity science, but really we've seen a lot in sort of cultural dynamics and so on and so forth. And that's also what I'm going to look a little bit at here. So the basic idea is that you have these complex dynamic systems, so these systems that consist of a lot of variables that change over time, and that change is not irrelevant, right? And essentially they display some self-similar and scale invariant behavior. So self-similarity, or this sort of fractal behavior, you probably already know. We have a good example of this, where essentially you have a sort of you have the microstructure of an object is sort of replicated at or replicates the macrostructure, right? We find the same in temporal system, or sort of the temporal evolution of a system. So here you have a time series, and if you zoom in on that, you'll see that actually the small parts, the sort of minor parts of the system, or the fluctuations at shorter time scales are similar to fluctuation at larger time scales. So you have this kind of like same sort of fractal property, or this self-similar property. So essentially what we have is fluctuation patterns at longer time scales. They resemble or similar to fluctuation patterns at shorter time scales, and essentially also the scale invariant properties, so that the measurement does not really depend on the temporal resolution. What you actually see is that the systems are sort of the evolution of the system is sort of proportionate to itself, right? So essentially what you find is sort of this property is something that we actually find is in many systems, both natural and cultural or social. And that's essentially what I want to look at. What we often have is some highly irregular time series like this, right? So what can you really do with this? If you look at this, many people just say, well, you know, there's some fluctuation. Okay, there's some, it's pretty regular, right? Because you have these spikes at certain times, and this essentially represents the collected writings of some person, some known person in Denmark, and what we can, and it's characterized, these collected writings are characterized with one variable, essentially the entropy. So the sort of one way of thinking about that is essentially, at least if it's modeled like this, is essentially like the sort of the lexical variation of a writer, right? So another way to do that would be measuring the type token ratio, or it's done a lot of digital humanities, or the readability or something like that you could do over time, and you'll see typically a highly irregular time series like this, right? With initially no clear pattern, but still you have this sort of these minute repetitions over the signal, right? So essentially what we want to do is we want to investigate the relationship between the measurement, right? So and the time scale, right? We want to see if there's some sort of power law relationship. We want to see if there's some relationship between the measurement, how you sort of represent the system. So for instance, the entropic states and the scale, right? So is it the case that small windows are sort of, in a sense, repeated at larger time scales, and so on and so forth, right? And then we want to detect changes in this system as a result of sort of external or internal events, right? So in this case, if you have a writer, it might be that something happened in his life here. But it could also be that this could be an external event. So this guy actually got banned by the Danish state, or censored by the Danish state, right? But it could also simply be, or not simply, but be sort of a psychological change in that writer. So it might be that this guy was actually highly manic. So in periods he was very active. In other periods he really didn't produce anything. That's not a sufficient condition for being manic, but it is indeed a necessary one for a manic writer. Now, what we also might want to do is we want to compare these kind of these system dynamics within. So basically, we could look at, for instance, the lexical variation and the sort of affective states of this writer, and we could compare them, but we could also compare multiple systems to say, okay, so how does this writer, so he's probably a Danish writer, compared to another popular Danish writer? So this guy was called Grundtvig, that we represent here. He was a famous Danish pastor that created the Danish, basically more or less the ideology for a Danish national state. And you could compare him to a philosopher like Kierkegaard or H.C. Andersen, people that sort of were also highly productive and lived at the same time with him. So that's essentially what we want to do, right? So to dive a little bit more into the details of the strategy here. So sort of the way we've been thinking about this, at least in my group, is looking at this property of self-similarity or self-affinity. We're trying to look at how does fluctuation patterns at long time scales resemble fluctuation patterns at short time scales. And the way we do that is essentially that we take the original variable, so the characterization of the system, so that could be the lexical variability of of 3 different writers, for instance. So here we have somebody that's quite rigid, repeating themselves sort of a lot, so they fluctuate fast around some average. Then we have somebody that's sort of almost random, right? So we have some sort of white noisy pattern here where all that really matters is sort of local dependencies. And then you have something that has a much more interesting structure, because you see micro patterns are actually repeated at longer time scales here, right? So this has sometimes been, so if you're interested in the colors of noise, this is sort of moving towards what's called actually a very, very pink noisy pattern here, while you have some white noise here. Then what we essentially do is we construct a random walk. So we do that by integrating the time series. So that's what you see here. And then we essentially split that up into non-overlapping segments, right? So we split it up in windows at multiple time scales, and then we measure the variation in all well, we fit a polynomial and we measure variation around that, and we sort of look at the difference of the residuals, and then we plot the residuals over multiple time scales. So here we have the time scales, or the log of the time scales, and we plot that against the log of the residuals, right? So essentially, what you will then see is actually that this is a really smart way of figuring out what's sort of the fractal or self-similar structure here, because you get a slope, and if that slope is below 0.5, you have a system like this that's sort of quite rigid. If it's around 0.5, it's sort of almost random. You have only what's called short range correlation, so only neighboring data point depends on each other, and then sort of a longer and if it moves from 0.5 to 1, then you start to have this sort of fractal or self-similar property, right? Which is a good indication that some kind of general structure, some kind of general dependency sort of echoes all over the signal, throughout the signal, right? So this is called this slope here. This is called the Hurst exponent, or the Hurst parameter, and we published somewhat extensively on that. So the important part here is we can use that slope to quantify the persistence, so the degree to which there are these sort of self-similarities, fractal structure in any time series, right? So we can essentially force that hairball down into something that's basically that essentially a 3-state classifier, right? Either you're below your round sort of short range, or sort of a random process, or you are sort of above and have this persistence in it, right? So of course that requires a lot of pre-processing or representation learning, right? So we need to extract something that's where we can meaningfully figure out, measure, or estimate this slope. So let me give you a couple of examples of how we've done this. So this is the guy we saw from before. This is Grundtvig, he's called. Nikolaj Severin Frederik Grundtvig. He was a pastor that was a Danish pastor that was productive from the start of the 19th century to actually towards the end. And I worked with, well, she's a sort of scholar of religion and theology, and we worked on trying to figure out, can we take all his writings? So he was highly productive. He wrote over 1,000 works. The median length is around 4 pages, I think. So he also liked short. So he's written a lot of psalms and so on and so forth. And essentially what we wanted to see is, can we, in that, with all those texts, can we see how they are expressive of his sort of creative and sort of psychological development? So this is essentially author profiling, right? But it's historical author profiling. So we did a lot of different ways of dealing with this data, but we ended up essentially representing each work as the sort of lexical richness using a variant of Shannon entropy. There are some limit cases where that just results in something that's really weird, but at the outset, it turns out that Shannon entropy actually is predictive of the most readability scores, for instance. So it's reasonable to use, and we represent each work as it's sort of as sort of the entropic state or the entropy of it, and then we generate the time series you saw before, and then on that time series in Windows we estimate this persistence, right? And what you actually see is that, so this is the difference, so this plot shows the difference of the Hurst parameter, so that from a random time series, right? So essentially what we're seeing is everything above 0 will tell you that there's persistence, anything below 0 would point towards a sort of more anti-persistent or rigid state. And what you actually see is that the development here is what you detect is age, essentially. You see that in the early parts of Grundtvig's life, there's a sort of a persistence in his information or entropic states, right? So it seems that his state sort of echoes throughout his work. So one work influences the other over a longer time scale, while as he grows older, it becomes worse and worse and worse, and he becomes more and more and more rigid, ending up actually in just repeating his own work. So that's sort of a well-known fact about his writing, and you also notice this towards his end, right? So essentially, we managed to discover age. Is one way of seeing it, but it's interesting because we can essentially detect these change points in his life, and we can do that slightly different. You can look at a very coarse level where you can see he's young or younger and then he's old, or you can sort of go in and say, okay, he's initially there's persistence, then you get anti-persistence, then sort of almost random, then anti-persistent again, and so on and so forth, and these map on to events, actually significant events in his life, right? So this is one way of essentially having some highly complex, more than 1,000 works written by a highly literate scholar, and then turning that into a simple variable that evolves over time. Another project. This is something that this is done on Dutch newspapers. A very, very large collection of two Dutch newspapers, and together with Melvin Wevers, a good colleague, Melvin Wevers. So he's a historian, digital historian, and we looked at Dutch newspapers essentially just on keywords. So something like, well, a little bit more than that, but something similar to sort of Google Ngram, right? So the relative frequency over time of sets of keywords, right? So it's sort of very, very minimal sort of concept mining, right? So essentially what we looked at was how does the frequency of, for instance, potato evolve in the two newspapers and in advertisements, right? So we compare how the frequency of advertisements relate to the frequency of newspapers. Now, the interesting part was here that Melvin was wondering whether or not it was such that advertisements causally changes what media are talking about, right? So does advertisement work by essentially by some companies saying, okay, now we want to sell Coca-Cola, and we sort of make a lot of commercials, and then media responds to that. They start to sort of causally or be influenced by the use or by this increased frequency in Coca-Cola advertisement ads. But you could also think of it the other way around. It could actually be that it's because people start talking about new American trends, Coca-Cola, so on and so forth, and then advertisements respond and say, okay, now we are going to sell Coca-Cola. There's also the third option, essentially that none of them, that is not really a question of what advertisement and newspapers do, but really external events. So the ending of Second World War might increase the sort of general interest in American products, and both advertisements and articles will respond to that by discussing American products, something similar. So there are these sort of three options, or at least these three options. So first thing we looked at was essentially, again, this kind of persistence in these time series. So we have simple time series, and then we start looking at so these are the sort of keywords for the keyword for bread in Dutch, and then we start to look, how does this time series behave, or what is the sort of what kind of structure is hidden in this process. And what we find is actually that which might not be so So surprising is that advertisements actually seem to be much more chaotic. So they sort of not necessarily particularly active, and then they suddenly can increase sort of in this kind of sort of really rapid or chaotic behavior. So this is called on-off intermittent behavior, while um, while um, while newspapers seems to be much more sort of persistent or sort of seems to be more sort of structured, continuous structure in their use of these concepts. So this is essentially what we find here. And there are actually some differences between the two newspapers that seems to be robust. Interpretation is maybe a little bit more complex. Now we also then looked at this dependency level. So essentially what you find is, so essentially, is it the advertisements that influence articles? Is articles that influence advertisements, or is it this complex relationship? And what we find is essentially that for 20% we see this what we call shaping advertisements, shape articles. So this could be fashion products, for instance. So fashion tends to go in advertisements first and articles afterwards, while for other products it seems that articles are really the ones that are impacting advertisements, and then in the end for 17% of the cases, and then for almost 50% you see this complex relationship. So this could be, for instance, war impacts both content of advertisement and articles. Interestingly, this is systematic for product groups. So you see again, fashion, for instance, is typical for the shaping relationship, while energy and natural produce, potatoes, for instance, tend to have this complex relationship, right? So if there's war, suddenly people find cauliflower and potatoes very relevant compared to before. Right? So again, newspapers, keyword frequencies for a lot of words, massive amount of words, and then we try to estimate these sort of simple dependencies and the sort of persistence. So this was done using a quite simple causal model in this case. And we find that you have there are indeed sort of product groups and product specific causal relationships. Yet another project that we've been working on. This is a more recent project. Actually, it's ongoing now. I thought it had sort of ended, but now it turns out that it hasn't. So essentially what we're looking at here is narrative, so books, fiction, and we are trying to use sentiment analysis. Yeah, but it's been shown quite it's very popular to create these story arcs. So essentially you run a sentiment analysis of the content of a book at paragraph or sentence level, and then you plot the fluctuation of sentiment over time. And with some filtering, so the green and red lines here, you can actually sort of reconstruct the general story arc. So essentially, sort of in this case, we have Madame Bovary, and that has sort of this tragic structure, just get worse and worse and worse until she dies in it, right? So essentially, these were very popular some years back, and I then discussed this with a couple of colleagues, one of them being Matt Jockers, that sort of did a lot of work on this, and then he sort of did a lot of experiments with filtering that got a lot of criticism. So we proposed another filter, this adaptive filter. And since we started working with this, we thought, okay, so let's try to look at how this self-similar property or this Hurst parameter behaves of these sentiment or these story arcs, right? And what we actually found is that they that you can use them as a measure of what we would argue is narrative coherence. So as you move towards 1, narratives become more and more coherent. As you move towards 0.5, they become more and more incoherent, almost like a sort of collection of short stories. And if you go below 0.5, it becomes very, very rigid. The narrative becomes very, very rigid. We then did some further experiments and tried to look at the change point. So essentially, how does this window, so now we estimate the Hurst parameter, the self-similarity property in windows, and we can see that we can actually predict the major change points by the local minima on this process, which is windowed Hurst parameter, or so basically we can predict the changes in the story or the narrative as a function of this process. And we would like to argue that essentially this Hurst parameter is capturing the sort of the quality in some sense of the narrative because the basic idea here is a psychological theory that a reader has to be motivated. So for a reader to be motivated, the narrative shouldn't be too coherent, then it becomes too predictable, but it shouldn't be too coherent either. So essentially this would be the experience that you open a book and you're thinking, if it's too coherent, oh, from reading the first 2 or 3 pages, you think, I know where this is going to end, and you put down the book. But in the other end, you might have a situation where you read the first 2 pages, you see, you have no clue where this is going. You continue reading, you have no clue where this is going. So this is too incoherent, right? So essentially, this is the idea that the good narrative have to optimize this coherence. So you can essentially argue for some range, probably between 0.6 and 0.75, probably, for sort of having this sort of good narratives. And we can actually use this to predict, for instance, the relative sales numbers of Harry Potter, and even of what's it called? Winter is very popular TV series. Also, Winter is Coming thing, fantasy. We also looked a bit at the relative sales numbers of that. But more interesting, we also looked at at a collection of Danish books. And we find this very nice distribution where you can see actually the vast majority of Danish literature, at least the ones we had access to, were actually bland or boring. They end up around 0.5, some were rigid. So you have this very nice Gaussian distribution, slightly with a sort of slightly off towards the persistence, which we would argue is necessary for narratives. But more interestingly, in the right tail, what you see is that it's not unsystematic was placed there. H.C. Andersen, for instance, is massively represented in the right tail. So we actually see that things that would be classified as classics are indeed end up in this right tail of the Hurst parameter. Let me just take a break here. There we go. Any questions? You also, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Some of you, I just found Grundtvig. Yeah. Grundtvig is very popular, very important in Denmark. I think he's actually more important than Kierkegaard or H.C. Andersen. He has some international recognition, but not at all at the level of Kierkegaard and Andersen. Yet studies, and especially comparative studies of those three, have been very relevant in Denmark because they were they lived approximately at the same time and essentially have been extremely important to generating what might be called sort of the narrative or narratives about this sort of Danish nation. And if you're a researcher, they are also interesting for the simple reason that there are a lot of national funding for research in those three guys. All right, let's slowly, yeah.
So, Kristoffer, I have questions. So, since I don't read equations or functions, maybe it was on your slides, but could you then repeat? So, what features are you measuring with self-similarity measurement?
So it doesn't really, well, it does matter. But in this case, what we looked at sentiment, and we looked at the information density or the entropy of all the text, right? So essentially at the lexical level. So basically variation in words. And then we are looking at how does this, what's the structure over time of the sentiment, for instance, right? Is it such that there's this kind of persistence? So essentially that a sentiment echoes throughout the narrative, right? So this would translate into a reader essentially experiencing sort of a coherent affective state when they read. So they experience this as a positive novel, as something that moves towards a positive state or a negative state. So that's the idea. So you have sentiment, and then you see how sort of persistent that sentiment is. Really, it doesn't really matter persistence is not telling you what the state is. For that, you have to investigate the variation or the change in the sentiment. So what we saw here was Madame Bovary, and as you saw, it just gets worse and worse and worse, right? So that's essentially the sentiment.
Okay, and how you identify the sentiment?
So is it really, we do that in a lot of different ways. I think in this case, we just used a handful of dictionaries. But I mean, I know that the young ones in my group, they use now a lot of machine learning techniques for doing it. But if for the particular research project, we validate the results against a handful of dictionaries, right? So we since show that the results are robust across multiple dictionaries. But I mean, it's really just up to, I mean, you can propose a different approach, and then my bet would be we would get the same result, but at least that's an empirical question. I could actually show you this. We'll probably, let's see, time is okay. So, you know what? Let me take you through for the last 18 minutes. Let me take you through a research project that's ongoing. This will probably give you. And let me just so currently and try to sort of explain how we work from the beginning. So essentially what we are involved in now is pandemic information dynamics. I think many researchers are. So essentially we trying to look at how media responds to COVID-19. So we are actually part of the Danish national pandemic group. So we are sort of monitoring social media, for instance, and providing results for the Danish Prime Minister, essentially. But as part of that, we of course also conduct research. So we are not only monitoring. And one thing that, so I heard mentioned earlier the problem of copyright or proprietary data. And in Denmark, I think it's like everywhere else, we also saw example of sort of so Peter showed how the more recent newspaper data are more likely to be under copyright, and that's of course also a problem here. So we can get historical newspapers, but at the outset it's a little bit harder to get contemporary newspapers due to copyright. Now, due to COVID-19, we just contacted all the publishing houses and said, here we have a special case. We need access to all your data because otherwise we cannot contribute to the to sort of sufficiently monitoring developments, right? So it's a very reasonable argument, and so currently we basically have access to all newspapers in Denmark, all activities by 5,000 journalists and so on and so forth. So one of the things we're looking at is essentially how did newspapers respond to the initial outbreak in Denmark. So not the Chinese one, well, we're also looking at that, but really what we're interested in, how do they respond to the lockdown in Denmark? So what happens in early March, right? So essentially what we saw, so there's anthropologists working on this, and what they said essentially, when you expect data, essentially what happened is that initially you had a lot of events, like when COVID-19 broke out, and you saw a lot of events discussed in the newspapers, so Hong Kong protests, Iran-American confrontation, Trump impeachment. But as the virus spread across Europe and America, news media front pages, but front pages focused almost exclusively on the pandemic, and as it turns out, it evolves, all news sections are actually impacted by it. And then we thought, can we use this to essentially study the effect of global catastrophe on the dynamics of news media information, right? So, so essentially, whether or not you read this, I can talk you through it. So the problem here, as it is in essentially anything where you want to use computers, you have to find an appropriate formalism, so some way of representing this problem. And the way we want to represent this is essentially we want to study the change. So from any one newspaper front page, we want to see, so that's on a daily basis, right? We want to see how, so it's print newspapers. We want to see how does that change from day to day, right? So how much novelty is introduced, right? So one way of doing that is essentially just to look at the distance between for instance, the words on any one day and the window of words that were that goes before, right? So how much does any one day, so say today, differ from the week? So let's say the last 7 days, how much does the content differ from the week that went before that, right? So that's what we call novelty. And in this case, what we're using is a topic model. So each, so sort of these latent variable models. So essentially we're saying how much does the topic distribution of any one day differ from the previous D-days. So in this case, we're looking from the previous week. Based on psychology, that seems to be, or media psychology, it seems to be the window that people sort of remember as activity in. But that's not enough. We don't only want to see how much an article differs. We also want to see how much it resonates with the future. So you can think of this such that imagine that I were to if I have a new idea. So that means that the topic distribution of what I'm saying is going to change, right? And if all of you think it's relevant, then that will also change the way we talk about the problem tomorrow and the day after. But if all of you think it's just a silly idea, then the novelty might be high, but it won't resonate with the future. It's going to die out. And you can model that essentially just by reversing this. So that's what we do with what we call transients. So essentially how transient is any one idea. So that's just looking at the difference between the topic distribution today and the following D-days, so 7 days. And then the resonance is just the difference between novelty and transience. And then there's some additional arguments because this has been done before, but we have modified it to become symmetrical, which is very, very nice. Doesn't matter so much in this case, but it's very, very nice if you are slightly unsure about dating of particular events. That's why we've done it here. Essentially, this is an information theoretical model. So it's essentially, so for those of you interested, this is essentially we are measuring the windowed relative entropy between any one day and the previous days and any one day and the following days in this window of length D. So if you look at that, the relationship between novelty, so how much does it differs, how does any one front page differs from the past, and the resonance, so how much does it sort of stick or with the future, you'll see that in general, there's sort of a reasonable to strong correlation or association between these two, and we can look at this. So this is basically a baseline. So what we want for different newspapers, so we have a tabloid here, we have a right-wing newspaper, we have a left-wing newspaper, and then sort of a center-left newspaper. And you find that the beta coefficient, or the other way to sort of look at the sort of the correlation or the association based on sort of a linear model that runs from approximately 0.5 to 0.6 something, right? So this is sort of our reference point. And then if we actually look at how novelty evolves over time. So here we have the sort of December 2019, then Wuhan. So here we basically have the initial breakout in China. Then slowly we have the virus outbreak here in Denmark. Nothing really, the newspaper doesn't really seem to respond. But then suddenly there's a drop, and the drop in novelty is around the lockdown, right? So this is essentially, here what you see is suddenly the topic distribution becomes lexical distribution becomes extraordinarily similar to what happened before, right? So it becomes very similar. And then slowly, as we turn towards the opening, so this happens in May, then slowly we are moving up towards the sort of regular state of the system, as you see here, although not return entirely. Now, this becomes extremely interesting if you look at the resonant behavior, so the degree to which this change actually sticks. Because normally, if you see a drop in novelty, you would expect the same in resonance, right? Given this. Now, what you actually see is the opposite. You see a lack, or actually a negative correlation or anti-correlation between the two. So right around the lockdown, so you essentially see that the resonance increases. So this means essentially that the newspapers start repeating the same thing over and over and over again, right? So essentially, there's no novelty, but the lack of novelty sticks. So the one message they have sticks. It hangs there every day, and slowly they sort of struggle to return to sort of some normal. So this we call an information decoupling. And this can be measured in a topic model. It can be measured in a sort of just a lexical distribution. It works in some sort of document embedding if you wanted. Anything where you measure the difference between, where you can measure the difference over time. And here essentially we are fitting this linear model over time, and you can basically take the slope of that. So for these time windows, and you can see here we have the decoupling. So this is exactly what happens around here. So sort of the lockdown state. So whenever you see a decoupling like this, it will be a very, very good indication of a sort of some sort of catastrophic event that takes over the news completely. Now, this is just some. So of course, we're not only inspecting time series. I mean, we are actually trying to model them and figure out whether or not this is sort of robust finding. So this is an example of how we're doing this, sort of confirming that we actually have a reliable or two reliable change points located around here and there. This is for one specific newspaper. And this is just the process for that. If some of you are worried about, say, the statistical reliability of this or something like that. It's interesting because you can then compare newspapers, and you will see that right-wing newspapers have the same decoupling, but it actually is high. They spend more time on sort of returning to the normal state. And as it turns out, when you inspect this model, it's actually it actually turns out that they basically have two catastrophes. They also see the opening as a smaller catastrophe. This is probably related to the fact that we have a center-left government at the moment that responded by very sort of abruptly closing down things and sort of limiting people's freedom rights, and that was also reflected in the opening. So there was a lot of restrictions on what you can do. You guys have probably experienced the same thing, and this and the right-wing newspapers considered that also a sort of a catastrophe, almost at the level of the initial lockdown, and this can be detected in a slightly more nuanced analysis. So this is just a variation of that analysis, but here we are basically looking on this slope as it evolves in windows over time, and you find the same structure, the decoupling here, but this massive, so this is the Politiken, the first newspaper you saw, and this is the second you saw, and you see the same sort of the second catastrophe here, but you also see that something similar is going on in the Politiken, but it's much more pronounced, and it then repeats itself for the right-wing newspaper, left-right-wing here. We've done this for all Danish newspapers, and there are complicated problems when you start looking at tabloids. Tabloids respond very differently. But it's enough for us to now propose what's called the news information decoupling principle, which essentially states that in response to unexpected and dangerously temporally extended events, the ordinary information dynamics of news media are initially decoupled such that the content novelty decreases, right? So essentially the content becomes very similar to what happened the day before, as the media focus monotonically on the catastrophic event, but the resonant property of that content, right, that increases, right, because the continued relevance of that event propagates throughout the system, right? So this is essentially sort of a conceptual formalization of the news decoupling that we saw. And you can then work with actually representing this as it evolves. Here we are essentially again comparing the novelty and resonance for 7 newspapers, and well, at least to me, it's very clear what's the tabloid and what's the omnibus newspapers. These are, this column and this row are omnibus, right? They almost respond, all of them, at the same time. So you're measuring the distance, the minimal distance between novelty and resonance, while the 2 tabloids, Ekstrabladet and BT, respond very, very differently. They actually do not show that kind of response. So they follow a different kind of dynamic. We've done a little bit of work recently on looking at what they actually do. So the interesting part is that if you look at the sort of emotional coherence, so if you do some like sentiment analysis again and look how coherent that is over time, then if you look at omnibus newspapers, they almost don't care, right? So they really don't, they at least want to create the image that they are not sort of particularly effective. And if they have an effective state, it really depends on the local story, right? So you might have a single story that's very effective, and that might impact the next time that story is mentioned, but it's sort of constant. So generally, they're either pretty rigid in their emotional use of emotion terms, or they sort of just almost random. However, these two are our 2 tabloids, and what you see there is actually that one response from tabloids is that they build up essentially a coherent emotional state throughout the virus, right? So essentially, they are fear mongering. So they are essentially more or less spreading fear, and there's the other response where they actually become more and more rigid, searching for sort of a reasonable response compared to what they normally do. So again, we can actually detect the virus and the opening using then the effective states or the emotional vocabulary of the newspapers for tabloids, and compare that to the omnibus newspapers, and see that indeed they do respond in effective states. And this is interesting because sort of sentiment or effective analysis of newspapers is not trivial because probably some values about sort of what is objectivity and facticity in journalism, and so on and so forth. Now, just to summarize this, your data are noisy, or our data are noisy and complex. We need to do a lot of things to them. So you mentioned some of them. You can do some, you essentially what you have to do is you have to find some reasonable representation. You have to learn some representation from your data that makes it possible for you to extract this small set of temporal indices or small set of variables that can help us understand the sort of underlying data generating mechanism, right? So we go through steps, not only sort of normalizing the data, but also finding reasonable representations of those data. So say a topic model, sentiment analysis, whatnot. And then we can use those representations to sort of build these 1, 2, or 3 dimensional time series. I think that the dynamics of looking at how these variables evolve over time are really the key to answering questions about the fine-grained pattern of variation. And I think this is not trivial if you are a humanist researcher. Many humanists are actually not so impressed or interested in the sort of large-scale analysis. They have a tradition for looking at sort of minute detailed analysis, and what you really want is to be able to answer questions at that level. And then, because of the nature of computers, it's normally pretty easy to scale it to sort of some high, much larger data set, of course, depending a little bit on your infrastructure. Finally, and I know this was actually discussed quite a lot, but also at the DHN this year, I also saw many sort of people leaning towards formalism, but I would say that the domain knowledge of the system, so the knowledge that the historian, that the media analyst, that the anthropologist has, is really the knowledge that should be decisive for the choice of formalism. They should be driving the way you choose to represent your data. It's sort of and their knowledge should also be the ones. How should I put it? The knowledge that should censor censor the decisions that are being made, right? So it's really important not to just put a long pipeline in front of humanities researcher, social scientist, and then let them sort of decide on the research question, pour the data into the pipeline, and then give them some visualization in the end. I think they should really be involved in the entire process, and building infrastructure is really about building sort of a space around them where this can be realized. The tragedy is that this is expensive because people in our part of the world cost more than machines, really. Yes, thank you. That was 1 minute more than bargained for in a way. But here you essentially have the link to the slides. They should be there by now.